They are still here. That is the part nobody wants to say out loud. The families you have been told no longer exist, the dynasties that supposedly dissolved after governments cracked down, after wars stripped their empires, after public outrage forced them underground, they did not disappear. They restructured, they rebranded, they disappeared from the only place that actually mattered, the list. Forbes publishes its annual rankings every year like clockwork. Billionaires smiling on glossy magazine covers, new tech founders, real estate moguls, inherited wealth dressed up in philanthropy. And every year, the world watches and assumes that list is the full picture, that if someone is truly powerful, truly wealthy, they would be on it. But what if the most powerful families in history made a deliberate, strategic decision to never appear on that list again? What if invisibility is not a weakness, but the final, ultimate expression of power? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is economics. This is history. And by the time this video is over, you will understand exactly how certain families, some of whom controlled more wealth than entire nations, engineered their own disappearance from public record, and why that disappearance only made them more powerful. Stay with this, because the middle of this story is where everything changes. Let us go back to a number, one number that anchors everything that follows. In 1913, the Rockefeller family's total estimated wealth, when adjusted for today's inflation, sat somewhere between $400 and $700 billion. Some economists push it higher. That would make John D. Rockefeller not just the richest American in history, but arguably the wealthiest private individual who has ever lived on this planet. And yet, if you look at the Forbes billionaire list today, you will not find a single Rockefeller in the top 50. You will barely find them in the top 500. Where did the money go? The obvious answer, the answer most people accept without thinking, is that it spread out, diluted through generations, divided among children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren until the fortune fragmented into hundreds of ordinary-sized inheritances. That is the story the textbooks tell. That is the story the family's own public relations machinery quietly encouraged for decades. It is not the whole story. The Rockefeller family did not lose their wealth. They transformed it into something that cannot be measured by conventional metrics, something that does not show up on a Forbes spreadsheet, because Forbes was never designed to track it. The family moved their assets into a structure so legally sophisticated, so institutionally embedded, that their wealth became indistinguishable from the infrastructure of American society itself. The vehicle was called a family office, and what the Rockefellers pioneered in the early 20th century became the template that every major dynasty would eventually copy. A family office, at its simplest, is a private company that manages the financial and personal affairs of an ultra-wealthy family. But that description undersells it by an enormous margin. The Rockefeller Family Office, eventually formalized as Rockefeller Capital Management, did not just manage investments. It managed the family's political relationships, their philanthropic positioning, their real estate empire, their stakes in hundreds of companies, their legal structures, and, crucially, their public narrative. It was a shadow corporation whose only client was the family itself. And here is the critical insight. When wealth lives inside a family office, it becomes almost entirely invisible to outside measurement. There is no public filing requirement. There is no stock ticker. There is no annual report that journalists can analyze. The wealth exists. It compounds, it grows, it generates returns, but it does so in a private dimension that the public financial system was simply not built to see. By the time Forbes started publishing its billionaire list in 1982, the Rockefellers had already been operating in this invisible layer for nearly 60 years. They were not absent from the list because they had lost their wealth. They were absent because they had built a structure that made measurement impossible. Now pause, because you might be thinking, okay, one family figured this out. That is interesting, but it is isolated. It is not isolated. What the Rockefellers pioneered, At least 4 other dynasties perfected, and some of them started earlier, operated on a larger scale, and went even further in engineering their disappearance from public consciousness. The name most people know is Rothschild, and the moment that name appears, half the audience shifts uncomfortably, because the Rothschild family has been used as a target by conspiracy theorists for so long that even mentioning them seriously feels dangerous. But strip away the mythology, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the exaggerated claims, and what remains is genuinely remarkable. The Rothschild banking dynasty was, by any rigorous historical measure, the most powerful private financial institution in the world for most of the 19th century. At their peak in the 1800s, the family controlled wealth equivalent to roughly $2 trillion in today's money. They financed wars. They determined which governments could borrow and at what rate. The Duke of Wellington, before the Battle of Waterloo, said that without Rothschild financing, Britain could not have sustained the campaign against Napoleon. $2 trillion. Let that sit for a moment. And today, the Rothschild family does not appear on any major wealth ranking. Their banking group, Rothschild and Company, is publicly traded in Paris, but the family's actual stake and the full extent of their wealth structure is almost impossible to reconstruct from public information alone. Why? Because of what happened in 1982. That year, the same year Forbes launched its Billionaire list, the Rothschild family made a decision that looks, in retrospect, like either brilliant foresight or extraordinary coincidence. They began a decades-long process of consolidating and restructuring their European banking interests into a privately held entity. They took assets that had been partially visible to the public and moved them behind a wall of private holding structures, trusts, and family foundations spread across multiple jurisdictions. They did not do this because they were in trouble. They did it because they understood something fundamental about wealth preservation in the modern era. Visibility is a liability. The moment you are on a list, you become a target. For taxation, for regulation, for litigation, for political attention, for public resentment, for the kind of populist pressure that can, over decades, genuinely erode a fortune. The families that have survived across generations, not just decades, but actual centuries, did so by mastering the art of strategic invisibility. But this is where everything changes. Because the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds are just the entry point, the families that truly disappeared, the ones whose names you will almost certainly not recognize, operated at an entirely different level of sophistication, and their techniques reveal something deeply important about how wealth actually behaves over long-time horizons. Consider the Bettencourt family. Most people know that Liliane Bettencourt, heir to the L'Oréal fortune, was for many years the richest woman in the world, but the Bettencourt family's actual structure is a masterclass in compartmentalization. The L'Oréal stake that everyone can see, that gets reported in the newspapers, represents only the visible layer of the family's wealth. Beneath it sits a network of investment structures, real estate holdings, and private equity positions that are essentially untrackable by any public means. When Liliane Bettencourt passed away in 2017, the public conversation focused on her Forbes ranking and the inheritance her daughter Françoise would receive. But the family's advisors had spent years, decades, ensuring that the most significant assets were already safely inside structures that would transfer without triggering either public attention or maximum taxation. The wealth that the world saw was a fraction of the wealth that actually transferred. Now consider a family most people have never heard of, the Mulliez family of France. They own Auchan, one of Europe's largest retail chains. They own Decathlon, the sporting goods empire. They own Leroy Merlin, the home improvement chain. They own stakes in dozens of other businesses across multiple continents. By any reasonable estimate, the combined Mulliez family fortune sits somewhere above 35 billion euros. Some analysts put it significantly higher. They do not appear on the Forbes list. Not because they are not wealthy enough, they are. They appear occasionally on French wealth rankings, but even those rankings are widely acknowledged to be significant underestimates. The Mulliez family made a formal, documented, legally structured decision generations ago that the family's wealth would be held collectively, inside a structure called the Association Familiale Mulliez, and that no individual family member would ever be listed as controlling enough wealth to trigger major public reporting requirements. The AFM has formal rules, it has a constitution, it has mechanisms for managing disputes between family branches, and crucially, it has rules about public visibility. Individual family members are not permitted to accumulate wealth in ways that would put them on public lists. The collective stays invisible precisely because no individual is ever visibly wealthy enough to attract serious scrutiny. This is not accidental, this is engineering. And the engineering goes even deeper when you examine the tax structures that underpin these arrangements. The most powerful tool available to multi-generational dynasties is the dynasty trust. In certain U.S. states, Delaware, South Dakota, Nevada, and in certain offshore jurisdictions, the Cayman Islands, Liechtenstein, Singapore, it is possible to create a trust structure that can hold assets for literally hundreds of years, in some cases indefinitely, without triggering inheritance tax at each generational transfer. Assets placed in these structures compound across generations without the 30 to 40% haircut that ordinary wealth transfers suffer every time a patriarch or matriarch dies. The math of this is genuinely staggering. If a family places $1 billion into a dynasty trust structure in 1950, and that trust generates an average annual return of 7%, which is historically quite conservative for a well-managed portfolio, by 2024, that original billion has grown to somewhere between $80 and $100 billion, without ever appearing on a Forbes list, without ever generating a single public news story about its growth, without ever triggering inheritance tax. That is how wealth survives across centuries. Not through genius investment decisions, not through extraordinary entrepreneurship in every generation, through structure, through legal architecture, through the deliberate and sophisticated use of tools that exist in plain sight but are only accessible to people who already have enough money to pay for the advisors who know how to use them. And this is where the story gets uncomfortably relevant to everyone watching. Because the techniques we are describing, the family office structure, the dynasty trust, the collective holding company, the strategic invisibility, these did not develop in a vacuum. They developed in response to a specific historical moment, the rise of the progressive tax state in the early 20th century. When governments around the world began implementing serious income taxes and inheritance taxes, in the United States after 1913, in Britain after the First World War, across Europe through the 1920s and 1930s, the families that already had wealth faced an existential choice. They could accept the new tax reality and watch their fortunes gradually erode, or they could hire the smartest lawyers and accountants in the world and build structures that would survive the new environment. They chose the latter, almost uniformly. And the structures they built were so effective that they did not just protect existing wealth. They created a compounding advantage that grew with every passing decade. While ordinary wealthy families watched their estates diminish under inheritance taxes with each generational transfer, the dynasties that had properly structured themselves kept compounding. The gap between visible wealth and invisible wealth widened continuously. By the time Forbes published its first billionaire list in 1982, the families that appeared on it were, in many cases, not the richest families in the world. They were the richest families whose wealth was structured in ways that made it publicly visible and countable. The truly old money, the multi-generational dynasties that had been operating for a century or more, had already moved to a different dimension. Think about the DuPont family. In the early 20th century, they controlled the largest explosives and chemical company in the world. Their wealth was so concentrated and so politically significant that the U.S. government actually filed antitrust suits against them. But by the time the modern era of wealth tracking began, the DuPont fortune had been so thoroughly distributed through trusts, foundations, and family holding structures across multiple generations that no individual DuPont was visibly rich enough to attract serious Forbes-level attention. The family's collective wealth remained extraordinary, but the individual wealth was deliberately kept below the threshold of visibility. Or consider the Phipps family. Henry Phipps was Andrew Carnegie's business partner, and when Carnegie Steel was sold to J.P. Morgan in 1901 to create U.S. Steel, Phipps received roughly $50 million, equivalent to somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion in today's money. That fortune was immediately placed into a trust structure so sophisticated for its time that legal scholars still study it. The Bessemer Trust, named after the steel-making process, was originally the Phipps family office. It grew into a major wealth management firm, but the original family money, the money that seeded it, has been compounding in private structures for over a century. The Phipps family is still wealthy, extremely wealthy. They simply made a decision, generations ago, to never let that wealth become visible. The pattern is consistent, the technique is consistent, and the outcome is consistent. Wealth that stays invisible stays intact. Now here is the uncomfortable truth at the center of all of this. The thing that makes this story more than just a fascinating historical documentary. The same structural advantages that allowed these families to compound their wealth in invisible structures are still available today, not to everyone. The entry costs are significant. A properly structured family office, with the legal and financial expertise required to build multi-jurisdictional dynasty trust structures, costs somewhere between $2 and $10 million per year to operate effectively. Dynasty trust structures in the most favorable jurisdictions require initial assets of at least $10 to $20 million to make the legal setup costs economically rational. But the principles are not financially gated in the same way. The underlying logic, that structure determines outcomes more than individual investment decisions, that legal architecture is itself a form of wealth, that visibility is a liability and not a virtue. These are insights that scale down. The single most important lesson from the families that deleted themselves from Forbes is this: they understood that wealth preservation is not the same as wealth generation. Most people spend their entire financial lives focused on generation, on earning more, on investing better, on finding the next opportunity. The dynasties that survived across centuries were equally obsessed with preservation, with protection, with the structural foundations that would allow whatever they built to survive contact with taxes, with market downturns, with generational transfer, with the ordinary entropy that dissolves most family fortunes within 3 generations. The 3-generation rule is real. Researchers who study multi-generational wealth have documented it extensively. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, the saying goes. The first generation builds, the second generation consolidates, the third generation dissipates. Across cultures, across time periods, across different economies, the pattern repeats with striking consistency. Roughly 70% of family wealth is gone by the second generation, 90% by the third. The families we have been discussing beat those odds by orders of magnitude. The Rockefellers are now in their 6th or 7th generation of coordinated wealth management. The Rothschilds have been operating as a coherent financial entity for over 200 years. The DuPonts have maintained family cohesion around their wealth for nearly as long. They beat the 3-generation rule because they treated their wealth not as a collection of assets, but as an institution, with governance, with rules, with a constitutional framework that placed the health of the collective above the desires of any individual, with professional management that brought in outside expertise precisely because they understood that family sentiment and financial discipline are often in direct conflict, and they beat the 3-generation rule by getting off the list. Because the Forbes list and the culture of public wealth display that surrounds it is actually one of the most reliable predictors of generational wealth destruction. The families that court visibility, that allow their wealth to become part of their identity, that tie their sense of self-worth to their public ranking, those families consistently underperform over long time horizons. Because visibility generates pressure. Pressure generates decisions made for reputational reasons rather than financial ones, and reputation-driven financial decisions are almost always wealth-destroying. The invisible families made one more move that is worth understanding, because it is perhaps the most counterintuitive of all. They gave money away, publicly, dramatically, in ways that attracted enormous press attention and genuine public admiration. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment, the Ford Foundation. Generation after generation of these families made highly visible philanthropic gifts that permanently altered public perception of the family name. On the surface, this looks like generosity, and in many cases, it genuinely was, but it also served a structural purpose that is rarely discussed openly. Public philanthropy at scale accomplishes two things simultaneously. It converts taxable assets into tax-advantaged foundation assets, where the family retains significant control over deployment while eliminating the tax liability. And it generates exactly the kind of positive public attention that makes governments, regulators, and the general public disinclined to scrutinize the rest of the family's financial structure too carefully. The Rockefeller name, by the mid-20th century, was synonymous with philanthropy in American public life, and that reputation created a political shield around the family's private financial structures that no amount of legal maneuvering could have manufactured alone. This is the full picture. This is how the disappearance was engineered, not through illegal means, not through fraud or deception, through the sophisticated application of legal tools that existed in plain sight, through governance structures that treated wealth as an institution rather than a possession, through strategic philanthropy that converted assets and built reputational protection simultaneously, and through a fundamental philosophical commitment to invisibility as a feature, not a bug. The families that deleted themselves from Forbes did not disappear. They simply moved to a layer of the financial world that was never designed to be visible to the public, and they have been operating there, compounding quietly for generations. And here is the final thought that ties this whole story back to where we started. In 1982, when Forbes published its first billionaire list with 40 names, it was widely celebrated as a transparency measure. Finally, the public could see who was really wealthy. Finally, the old hierarchies of power would be exposed. Finally, the mysterious fortunes of the great dynasties would be dragged into the light. But the list did not expose the old dynasties. It created a new category of visible wealthy, mostly new money entrepreneurs and first-generation billionaires whose wealth was still in forms simple enough to be counted. And it allowed the old dynasties to remain exactly where they had always been, behind the curtain, invisible, compounding. The Forbes list is not a window into the true distribution of wealth. It is a window into the fraction of wealth that was either too new, too simple, or too public to have been properly hidden yet. The real list, the one that would show you where the multi-generational wealth actually lives, does not exist, because the people who would be on it made sure, generations ago, that it never could. They did not delete their names from Forbes. Forbes was never designed to find them in the first place. If this changed how you think about wealth and power, subscribe to FinTrove, because the next video goes somewhere most financial channels are afraid to go.